The pursuit of transformation is not a modern invention. Long before the language of psychology gave us frameworks for understanding the self, another tradition encoded the mystery of human metamorphosis in symbols of fire, metal, and philosophical gold. Alchemy, dismissed by the rational mind as primitive chemistry or occult nonsense, concealed within its arcane imagery a sophisticated map of inner transformation, one that would eventually capture the attention of Carl Gustav Jung, who recognized in these medieval manuscripts not failed science but successful psychology. The alchemist stood before the furnace not merely to transmute lead into gold, but to witness in the bubbling retort a mirror of his own soul's struggle toward wholeness. This was the great secret hidden in plain sight. The Prima Materia, the base material requiring transformation, was never truly the metal in the crucible. It was the alchemist himself. The laboratory became a theater of interiority, where chemical processes dramatized the stages of psychological development that Jung would later systematize as individuation. But why did transformation require such elaborate concealment? Why speak in riddles of dragons and lions, of philosophical mercury and the marriage of sun and moon? The answer reveals something essential about the nature of inner work itself. Direct instruction in self-transformation proves notoriously ineffective. The psyche resists frontal assault. It requires indirect engagement, symbolic resonance, images that speak to layers of consciousness beyond the rational ego. The alchemists understood what modern self-help culture continually forgets. Genuine transformation cannot be achieved through willpower alone or 10-step programs. It demands descent into the unknown regions of oneself, a journey for which symbolic language provides both map and protection. Jung's encounter with alchemy came at a crucial juncture in his own psychological development, during the years following his break with Freud, when he found himself navigating what he called his confrontation with the unconscious. In the cryptic texts of medieval alchemy, he discovered a tradition that had preserved across centuries knowledge of the psyche's autonomous processes. These old masters had charted the territory Jung was exploring in his own depths. Their imagery gave him a language for phenomena that modern psychology had no vocabulary to describe. The autonomous appearance of archetypal images, the numinous quality of certain psychological experiences, the sense that something beyond the ego was orchestrating an inner transformation according to its own mysterious logic. The central doctrine uniting alchemy and depth psychology rests on a radical proposition. The human psyche contains within itself an inherent drive toward wholeness, an autonomous intelligence that seeks integration of fragmented aspects of self into a unified consciousness. Jung termed this process individuation, the becoming of one's true self, distinct from both the collective expectations that shape the persona and the unconscious identifications that distort self-perception. The alchemical tradition encoded this same understanding in its core axiom. The transformation of base metal into gold required not external agents, but the liberation of the gold already latent within the lead. The gold was not created, but revealed. This seemingly simple chemical metaphor contains profound psychological insight. It suggests that the goal of inner work is not the acquisition of something foreign to oneself, not the adoption of an ideal self constructed by social conditioning, but the recovery of an authentic core that has been buried beneath layers of adaptation and defense. The alchemists insisted their work required three essential elements: the Prima Materia, first matter, the philosophical fire, and the Hermetic Vessel. Jung recognized these as psychological realities. The Prima Materia represents the raw, undifferentiated psychic material, the totality of one's experiences, traumas, potentials, and repressions that exist in chaotic, unintegrated form. This is not merely the Freudian unconscious, that reservoir of repressed wishes, but something more fundamental. The basic substance of psychic life before consciousness has organized it into coherent patterns. The philosophical fire in Jung's reading corresponds to the emotional intensity required for psychological transformation. Not ordinary emotion, but the concentrated affect that arises when consciousness confronts material it has long avoided. This fire cannot be generated through intellectual understanding alone. It ignites when one faces genuinely disturbing aspects of oneself, when the carefully constructed self-image cracks under the pressure of denied realities. The alchemists warned that this fire must be carefully regulated. Too much and the material burns to ash. Too little and no transformation occurs. Jung observed the same principle in analysis. Transformation requires optimal tension, enough psychological pressure to catalyze change, without overwhelming the ego's capacity to integrate new awareness. The Hermetic Vessel, the sealed container in which the alchemical work occurred, represents the temenos, the sacred space of psychological work. In practical terms, this is the analytical relationship, the therapeutic container, or the disciplined space of inner work where one commits to remaining present with difficult material rather than fleeing into distraction or defensive rationalization. The vessel must be sealed, meaning one must create boundaries that protect the work from premature exposure to judgment or the diluting effects of ordinary consciousness. Many spiritual traditions recognize this principle. Certain transformative processes require containment, protection from the outside world, while vulnerable reorganization occurs. But the true genius of alchemical doctrine, the insight Jung most valued, concerned the nature of the opus itself, the work. Alchemical texts describe the work as occurring both through the alchemist's efforts and through the spontaneous activity of the materials themselves. The adept provided conditions, the transformation itself unfolded according to nature. Jung saw here a description of the relationship between ego and self, the term he used for the organizing center of the total psyche, conscious and unconscious. Individuation is not achieved through ego effort alone. The ego cannot force the unconscious to reveal its contents on the ego's timetable. Rather, the ego must learn to cooperate with autonomous processes, to recognize when to act and when to wait, when to direct and when to receive. This introduces a paradox at the heart of inner alchemy. The work requires intense, sustained effort, yet the crucial transformations occur spontaneously, as if orchestrated by an intelligence beyond conscious control. Jung borrowed from alchemy the concept of the mercurius, that paradoxical substance described as both poison and cure, fixed and volatile, material and spiritual. Mercurius represented for Jung the paradoxical nature of unconscious contents. They appear as obstacles to consciousness, yet contain the very energy needed for transformation. They seem foreign to the ego, yet are essential parts of the total self. The alchemists spoke of their work as requiring patience above all other virtues. Some texts suggested the opus might require decades. This temporal dimension reveals something crucial about authentic transformation. Modern culture's obsession with rapid change, with breakthrough moments and sudden enlightenment, misses what the alchemists knew. Deep psychological reorganization occurs slowly, through repeated cycles of dissolution and coagulation, of breaking down old structures and allowing new forms to crystallize. Each cycle deepens the work. Each repetition reveals new layers. The goal of the opus was described in alchemical texts as the philosopher's stone, that miraculous substance capable of transmuting base metals and curing all diseases. Jung interpreted the stone as a symbol of the self, the integrated personality in which conscious and unconscious aspects are held in dynamic relation. The stone's miraculous properties metaphorically describe the psychological reality that follows individuation. A centered personality possesses resilience, creative capacity, and a certain imperviousness to circumstances that would shatter a fragmented psyche. Yet Jung emphasized a crucial point often missed in superficial readings of alchemical doctrine. The stone is not a final achievement, but a dynamic equilibrium. Individuation does not produce a static, perfected self, but establishes a living relationship between ego and unconscious that must be continuously maintained. The opus is never truly complete. This understanding separates authentic depth psychology from the fantasies of self-improvement culture, which imagines a final state of psychological perfection where inner work ends. The alchemical texts describe the opus as proceeding through distinct stages, though different traditions enumerated these stages differently. Jung focused particularly on the classical four-stage schema: Nigredo, Albedo, Citrinitas, and Rubedo, blackening, whitening, yellowing, and reddening. These were not merely chemical descriptions, but psychological territories through which consciousness must pass in its movement toward integration. The Nigredo, the blackening, represents the initial descent into the unconscious, the necessary encounter with what Jung called the shadow. This stage begins when something disrupts the ego's carefully maintained self-image. Perhaps a crisis, loss, failure, illness, forces awareness of aspects of self previously denied. Perhaps analysis or inner work brings to light behaviors and motivations that contradict the persona, the social mask one presents to the world. The Nigredo is characterized by depression, confusion, and a profound sense of disorientation. The alchemical texts describe this stage with imagery of death, decay, and putrefaction, the Prima Materia dissolving into black chaos. Psychologically, the Nigredo represents the necessary breakdown of inadequate conscious attitudes. The ego must experience its own insufficiency, must confront the ways its strategies for managing life have failed. This is not merely unpleasant, it is terrifying. The ego experiences the Nigredo as an encounter with meaninglessness, with the void. Everything previously certain becomes uncertain. Values that organized life lose their compulsory power. Jung observed that individuals in the Nigredo often report feeling as if they're going mad, experiencing the kind of existential vertigo that occurs when the ground beneath consciousness dissolves. The shadow, those aspects of personality that consciousness rejects and relegates to unconsciousness, must be engaged during the Nigredo. This is the personal shadow, composed of characteristics and impulses incompatible with one's self-concept. The ambitious professional must acknowledge his envy and ruthlessness. The devoted parent must admit her resentment and fantasies of escape. The spiritual seeker must face his pride and desire for superiority. Shadow work is excruciating precisely because it requires acknowledging that one is not who one believed oneself to be. But the Nigredo extends beyond the personal shadow into what Jung called the collective shadow, the dark potentials inherent in human nature itself. One must recognize one's capacity for cruelty, for self-deception, for tribalism, and hatred. This is the descent into what the alchemists called the massa confusa, the confused mass. Consciousness, encountering this darkness, feels contaminated, guilty by association with the species' historic crimes. Many retreat from inner work at this stage, finding the darkness unbearable. The albedo, the whitening, marks a turning point. After the dissolution of the Nigredo, a new consciousness begins to emerge, initially still fragile, tentative, but carrying a different quality than the naive consciousness that preceded the descent. The alchemical texts describe this stage as the appearance of the white dove, the manifestation of the soul. Psychologically, this represents the first genuine encounter with contents of the unconscious in differentiated form, not the overwhelming chaos of the Nigredo, but distinct images, figures, and symbols that seem to possess their own autonomous reality. Jung associated the albedo particularly with the emergence of the Anima, or Animus, the contrasexual aspect of the psyche. The Anima, for a man, appears as an inner feminine presence, often initially experienced in projections onto women who captivate and fascinate beyond reason. The Animus, for a woman, manifests as an inner masculine voice, often experienced as opinions and judgments that seem to come from outside oneself. These figures represent the possibility of relationship between consciousness and the unconscious. They are mediators, guides into the deeper regions of the psyche. Engaging the Anima or Animus requires a different approach than shadow work. The shadow must be acknowledged and integrated. The Anima, Animus must be related to as autonomous others. This marks a crucial development in inner work. Consciousness, beginning to recognize that the unconscious is not merely a repository of repressed content, but contains autonomous centers of organization with their own perspectives and intelligence. This stage involves what Jung called active imagination, a technique for entering into dialogue with inner figures, allowing them to reveal their nature and purpose rather than dismissing them as mere projections or fantasies. The albedo brings a sense of purification, of liberation from the oppressive darkness of the Nigredo. But the alchemists warned this stage contains its own dangers. The primary risk is identification with the spiritual, a premature flight into transcendence that bypasses unfinished work with the shadow. Many spiritual traditions describe this temptation, the inflation that occurs when one touches luminous aspects of the psyche and mistakes these experiences for enlightenment. Jung called this condition inflation, the ego's identification with archetypal contents, which produces either grandiose self-aggrandizement or its opposite, a crushing sense of unworthiness before the numinous. The Citrinitas, the yellowing, represents a stage some alchemical traditions omitted, but Jung found psychologically significant. This is the dawning of solar consciousness, the development of illuminated awareness that can hold both darkness and light without collapsing into identification with either. Citrinitas brings discrimination, the capacity to distinguish between genuine insight and wishful fantasy, between archetypal encounter and ego inflation. This stage involves the difficult work of separating one's authentic perceptions from the projections and distortions introduced by unconscious complexes. Psychologically, Citrinitas represents the refinement of consciousness that occurs through repeated engagement with unconscious material. One learns to recognize the characteristic feeling tone of genuine psychological insight versus the excited certainty of inflation. One develops what Jung called psychological mindedness, the capacity to observe one's own processes with some objectivity, to catch oneself in unconscious reactions and defensive maneuvers. This is not the detached observation of intellectual analysis, but a warm, curious attention to the movements of one's own soul. The Rubedo, the reddening, represents the final stage, though again final in a relative sense, as the opus continues throughout life. The Rubedo is characterized by the reconciliation of opposites, particularly the union of consciousness and unconscious in the symbol of the conjunctio, the sacred marriage. The alchemical texts depicted this stage with images of the chemical wedding, the union of king and queen, sun and moon, producing the philosopher's stone. Psychologically, the Rubedo represents the achievement of the self, not the ego self, but the integrated totality of the personality. This is not a state of perfection but of wholeness, in which conscious and unconscious aspects are held in dynamic tension. The individual who has reached this stage possesses what Jung called psychological robustness, not immunity to suffering, but the capacity to engage life's difficulties without fragmenting or regressing to primitive defensive patterns. The Rubedo brings certain characteristics Jung observed in individuals who had undergone deep inner work. First, a quality of presence. Such individuals seem more fully alive, more responsive to immediate reality because they're not imprisoned in unconscious complexes. Second, a capacity for genuine relationship. Having integrated rejected aspects of themselves, they project less onto others and can meet people with less distortion. Third, a sense of meaning that doesn't depend on external circumstances. Having discovered the self as the organizing principle of their lives, they possess an inner orientation that holds steady amid life's vicissitudes. But the alchemists insisted that even the philosopher's stone required ongoing work. The opus circulatorium, the circular work, continues throughout life. Each new situation potentially activates unconscious material requiring integration. Each stage of life, youth, middle age, elderhood, brings new psychological challenges. The Rubedo is not the end of the journey, but the establishment of a capacity to continue the work of individuation across all future circumstances. Jung noted that those who have undergone alchemical transformation, in the psychological sense, often describe a reversal of values. What seemed important in the ego's initial self-understanding, achievement, recognition, security, while not abandoned, takes secondary importance to the relationship with the self. The center of gravity shifts from external validation to inner authenticity. This doesn't mean withdrawal from the world, but engagement with it from a different ground of being. Every authentic path of inner transformation encounters a particular crisis, a moment when the entire enterprise seems futile, when the suffering inherent in the work appears unbearable and without purpose. The alchemists knew this moment well. Their texts describe it in images of the blackest black, the mortificatio, the death that must occur before rebirth. Jung called it the dark night, borrowing from the Christian mystical tradition, and recognized it as perhaps the most crucial and dangerous phase of individuation. This crisis differs from the initial Nigredo, the descent into shadow. The Nigredo involves confronting previously denied aspects of personality, difficult work certainly, but work that proceeds from a foundation of hope. One believes, however, tentatively, that facing the shadow will lead to integration, to greater wholeness. The crisis of the soul that follows is more devastating precisely because it strikes at this foundation itself. It raises the possibility that the entire project of inner work is an elaborate self-deception, that there is no self to be found, no wholeness to be achieved, only the grinding mechanics of a meaningless psyche producing illusions of significance. This crisis typically emerges after one has made considerable progress in inner work. One has confronted shadow aspects, begun relating to Anima or Animus, perhaps experienced moments of genuine insight and transformation. Then, unexpectedly, a profound despair descends. All previous gains seem superficial, temporary formations that dissolve under scrutiny. The work itself begins to feel like another defense mechanism, another way the ego maintains control by pretending to relinquish control. One suspects that the images arising from the unconscious are not messages from a deeper wisdom, but meaningless neural activity, that the sense of transformation is merely psychological rearrangement without genuine significance. Jung observed this crisis repeatedly in his own process and in his analyses. He recognized it as the moment when the ego encounters the self not as a benevolent guide, but as an overwhelming, incomprehensible reality that utterly transcends ego consciousness. The comfortable fantasy that one is making progress, becoming whole, achieving individuation, this fantasy must die. In its place comes the recognition that the self, if it exists at all, operates according to logic entirely foreign to ego consciousness, pursuing purposes that may have nothing to do with the ego's happiness or sense of meaning. The alchemists described this stage as the confrontation with death itself, not physical death, but psychological death, the ego's encounter with its own annihilation. Their texts speak of the raven's head, the skull, the tomb. They insisted the adept must willingly enter this death, must surrender to the process even when it feels like total obliteration. Resistance at this stage aborts the work. Flight into distraction, into premature meaning-making, into spiritual bypassing. Any of these allows the ego to evade the necessary encounter. What makes this crisis so devastating is its attack on meaning itself. Previous stages of inner work, however difficult, occurred within a framework of meaning. I am facing my shadow so that I can integrate it. I am working with my dreams so that I can understand my unconscious. The crisis of the soul dissolves this framework. One confronts the possibility that there is no inherent meaning in the process, that the frameworks themselves, Jungian psychology, alchemical symbolism, spiritual traditions, are elaborate defense mechanisms humanity has constructed against the terror of a meaningless cosmos. Jung called this the encounter with the collective unconscious at its most impersonal and alien level. Beyond the personal unconscious, beyond even the archetypal layer that produces meaningful symbols, lies something utterly other, the psychoid reality Jung postulated, where psyche and matter are not yet differentiated, where human categories of meaning and purpose do not apply. Consciousness, touching this layer, experiences existential vertigo of a profound order. One stands at the edge of an abyss with no bottom, no handholds, nothing to orient oneself. Many who encounter this crisis retreat from inner work entirely. They return to conventional consciousness, perhaps with some lasting integration of shadow material, but without having completed the opus. Jung noted this outcome without judgment. Not everyone is called to or capable of the full journey of individuation. But he also observed that those who do continue through this crisis, who somehow find the capacity to endure the apparent meaninglessness without fleeing, undergo a transformation of a different order than what preceded. The key, Jung suggested, lies in a paradoxical stance he called active passivity, or passive activity. One must actively maintain consciousness, must refuse to collapse into identification with the despair, or to flee into distraction, yet must passively submit to the experience, must allow it to work upon consciousness without trying to manage or control it. This is enormously difficult. The ego's natural response to threat is either fight or flight. It must now learn a third option, remaining present with what it cannot understand or master. The alchemical texts offer a crucial insight here. This death is not an ending but a necessary stage of transformation. The old king must die so the new king can emerge. Psychologically, this means a fundamental reorganization of consciousness must occur, one that cannot happen while the old structures remain intact. The ego's cherished self-understanding, its ways of making meaning, its strategies for managing uncertainty, all of this must be dissolved in the alchemical fire. What emerges afterward is not the same ego with improvements, but a consciousness fundamentally reordered, centered not in the ego's projects, but in service to the self. Jung observed that those who pass through this crisis often describe it in retrospect as the most valuable experience of their lives, the moment when genuine transformation became possible. But this recognition comes only afterward. During the crisis itself, there is only darkness, only the grinding work of remaining conscious when everything in oneself wants to flee. The alchemists were not being dramatic when they insisted their work was dangerous and not for everyone. They knew what they were describing, a psychological ordeal that if not survived could leave one shattered. What emerges from the alchemical opus is not a perfected human being, but something stranger and more valuable, a consciousness capable of holding contradiction, of embracing the paradoxical nature of existence without collapsing into simplistic resolutions. The individual who has completed significant inner work carries an unmistakable quality, difficult to name but immediately recognizable. Jung called it psychological maturity, but this phrase hardly captures the profound reorganization that has occurred. The primary characteristic is a fundamental shift in the locus of identity. The ego, which began the work identified with the persona, with social roles and self-concepts, has discovered itself to be part of a larger totality. Identity now includes, but is not limited to conscious self-understanding. One experiences oneself as both the ego and something more, the self that contains and transcends ego consciousness. This is not dissociation, but integration, a both-and rather than either-or consciousness. This shift manifests practically in a different relationship to suffering. The integrated individual does not avoid suffering. Indeed, having confronted the depths of the psyche, they may be more sensitive to suffering than before. But suffering no longer threatens identity. One can experience profound pain, grief, or despair without fragmenting, without losing the sense of a center that holds. The alchemists described this quality through the philosopher's stone, which was said to be indestructible, not because it couldn't be broken, but because its essential nature remained unchanged, regardless of external circumstances. Another crucial outcome is the capacity for genuine creativity. Jung distinguished between mere novelty and authentic creativity, the former being new arrangements of existing elements, the latter involving the emergence of something genuinely new from the unconscious. The integrated individual has established a living relationship with the unconscious and can serve as a conduit for creative contents. This applies not only to artistic creation, but to living itself. The capacity to respond to situations with freshness rather than falling back on habitual patterns. The relationship to meaning undergoes profound transformation. The ego's initial search for meaning, finding purpose in achievement, relationships, beliefs, gives way to a different understanding. Meaning is discovered to be not something one finds or creates, but something one participates in. The self, as the organizing principle of the psyche, naturally orients toward meaning. Aligned with the self rather than caught in ego concerns, one experiences life as inherently meaningful even in the absence of specific purposes or goals. Paradoxically, this profound inner work often leads to greater simplicity in outward life. Having integrated rejected aspects of personality and withdrawn projections from the external world, One needs less from circumstances. The compulsive quality that characterized earlier life, the driven pursuit of success, recognition, security, relaxes. This doesn't mean passivity or withdrawal, but engagement with life from a different ground. One acts from genuine choice, rather than unconscious compulsion. The relationship to others transforms fundamentally. Having encountered the full spectrum of human possibility within oneself, the capacity for both great good and terrible evil, for wisdom and foolishness, courage and cowardice, one meets others with less judgment and more compassion. Projection diminishes. One sees people more clearly, neither idealizing nor demonizing them. This makes genuine relationship possible, relationship based on reality rather than unconscious fantasy. Jung emphasized that individuation does not mean individualism or egocentricity. The integrated individual, paradoxically, relates more deeply to the collective than the unindividuated person. Having differentiated from unconscious identification with collective values, one can consciously choose how to engage with society. One serves the collective not from obligation or resentment, but from genuine connection to humanity and the recognition of one's embeddedness in the human story. The opus leaves one with certain unmistakable inner experiences. First, a sense of participation in something larger than personal existence, whether one calls this the self, the divine ground, or simply life itself. Second, the experience of synchronicity, meaningful coincidences that suggest connections between inner and outer worlds beyond causal explanation. Jung saw synchronicity as evidence that the psychoid level of reality, where psyche and matter converge, was not merely theoretical, but experientially accessible. Third, and perhaps most significantly, the integrated individual possesses what the alchemists called the medicine, not a literal substance, but the psychological capacity to facilitate transformation in others. Having made the journey themselves, they can recognize the stages others are passing through, can offer guidance without intrusion, can hold space for others' processes without trying to manage or control them. This is the true gift of the opus, not personal perfection, but the capacity to serve the individuation process in others. Yet Jung insisted on a final, crucial point. The opus is never complete. Individuation is not an achievement, but a continuous process. Each stage of life brings new material for integration. The stone, once achieved, requires ongoing work to maintain its potency. The circular work continues. Solve et coagula, dissolve and coagulate, again and again. What changes is not the necessity of the work, but one's relationship to it. Where the ego initially experienced inner work as burden or obligation, the integrated individual experiences it as participation in the fundamental nature of existence itself. The vessel, the fire, and the Prima Materia are not elsewhere. They are consciousness itself, turned toward its own depths with unflinching attention. The gold you seek is not produced by the work, but revealed by it, for it was always there, buried beneath layers of unconsciousness, waiting not to be created but to be remembered.